So, RWBY, Ice Queendom, which I think the first three episodes dropped a little over a week ago. I was busy, obviously, that's why I haven't got up here to do the video yet, but in terms of TV broadcasting, I think today is when episode 1 went up on Japan in terms of TV channels. And as a big fan of RWBY, I own every Blu-ray of all the volumes released. I was one of the eager fans when Volume 1 was initially releasing, rewatching each episode dozens of times as I anticipated the next episode. It was something that I always pondered. Would RWBY ever get maybe a 2D version, maybe animated by someone or some company that we come to have known and loved in the anime medium? And even though it wasn't maybe the biggest thing on my mind, it was always something I pondered. So to see it finally happen with this kind of retelling, reimagining, it's not a remake in the typical sense of we're just going to retell the first few seasons of RWBY. What seemingly they're doing is that they're what they're calling a canon adjacent, which is an odd phrase, to be honest. I had to look up exactly what that meant, I'm not gonna lie. But seemingly what's gonna happen is if you've seen the original RWBY, you're gonna see, in terms of the first 3 episodes, for the most part, a retelling of the trailers and the first handful of episodes of Volume 1. And yeah, they don't cover everything we saw in Volume 1, but they also clearly are carving their own new path as seen by the ending of the 3rd episode and the whole idea of, like, the interesting beasts that they're kind of going away from the typical norm you're expecting, the idea of invading your shadows and kind of, like, becoming inside your dreams and stuff. There's some cool new stuff they're doing, so seemingly there's going to be a lot of familiar content, but as they're telling, like, the first few volumes of the story, it seems like they're also going to be telling something completely new, and based on the title, one would suspect that the character Weiss is going to be the center focus of the main story and what type of demons are going to pop out. And as someone who thinks Weiss is... I always thought Ruby and Weiss were my favorite ever since the show kicked off in terms of the main 4 there. And it will be fun to see what they decide to do with that. RWBY as a show was always an interesting one. I mean, you used to get banned off r/anime if you tried to talk about RWBY on that Reddit. So it's an interesting turn of events that now they can't ban people for talking about RWBY because, god damn it, RWBY's being made by Studio Shaft. But RWBY was one of those things that it took so much influence from anime. The main creator, Monty Oum, who unfortunately passed away far too early after some health complications, he was a huge anime fan. He was a huge fan of all things cool. And I mean, within this episode, you get a Black Rock Shooter reference, which that was one of the anime that was a big influence for the man who made every character who had a weapon turn it into a gun of some sort. So in the case of RWBY, she has a sniper rifle that is also a scythe. Yang, who has these gauntlets that are basically a shotgun. You know, it's really cool to see how everything almost turns into a gun, but he made everything just so elegant. The fact that he looked at what cosplayers would need in order to be able to properly mirror the characters he's making, but also understand that they would be okay. So in the case of all of these amazing outfits, he made sure they all had pockets, so that when a cosplayer is making and trying to make it picture perfect, they'll have a place for their phone and their other things so they don't have to add in pockets that will ruin the cosplay. Like, that's just the type of creator he was, on top of animating some of the craziest fight scenes an entire team could only dream to animate, and he did it single-handedly. It's not to say RWBY was like this picture-perfect production. There was a lot of sloppiness with even the 3D for like the first half of its run. And yeah, the writing can be a bit of a roller coaster, but it's something that just captured fans because it was such an immersive world with great personalities and amazing fight scenes. And to see how Studio Shaft turned that 3D into a 2D production, yes, you can argue it's a pretty easy transition, seeing how it was basically anime influenced to begin with. But the idea of the style of RWBY, both how they detailed the world, detailed background characters, even in the early seasons of RWBY, they didn't have the time and resources to animate every single background character, so they would sometimes make them into shadow blobs. But not in the way that it looked ugly, but more so you just didn't have details, but you could see people walking in the distance. It was pretty cool to see how Shaft did that even like when they're leaving the initial plane as they're boarding for their school there. It was just really nice to see how, both with retelling those incredible fight scenes, the initial fight with RWBY basically just casually listening to her music and seeing the robber, seeing how she's spinning around on her scythe, it was really cool to see how they were animating things like Crescent Rose and all those other things. But it was nice to see that the general aesthetic and the comedic timing and just the presentation, it felt like what the fans had come to love, but without any of the negative kind of like early stages of the production that, it is obviously, if you don't have nostalgia for early seasons of RWBY, you're probably going to have to push through some of the visual underwhelming aspects, given it didn't age all that well outside of the amazing fight scenes. But the thing that I think makes me so excited about this one is that yes, if you've seen the original RWBY, you're going to have a better time than probably those who haven't. In the way of, you're going to have a deeper understanding of the characters, you're going to have a deeper understanding of where things can change and deviate, but it's not to say that a newcomer to RWBY Ice Queendom couldn't watch this and enjoy it. That would be ridiculous to say. The main difference is that it basically relies on two separate things. One, if you know of the original RWBY, you're going to immediately recognize when things are about to get interesting, because now we're deviating away, or in the case of some of those key fight scenes, like, okay, we're seeing the bird, we're about to see our girl rush up the wall and basically cut its head off. Or in the case of the ending and the kind of foreshadowing of the things on their neck, things are popping up. But even though, if you've never watched the original, you still get a solid-ass story, all things considered. I was actually surprised by how they were able to retell so much content, and yes, they ignored a lot of the stuff that happened in the early stages of RWBY, but I would argue it's not necessarily all that important. The biggest pacing issue, I would honestly argue, was episode 3, when they started to really get into the school stuff, and the transformation of Weiss going from distrusting Blake to then kind of being like, we're friends, rely on us. The good thing about the original is that there was a bit more padding, and the bitchiness kind of had time to sink in rather than just kind of like a light switch. I'm not saying it doesn't work, but that's one of those instances of knowing the original. It makes that type of transition a little easier to stomach because you already have connection to what came before. But with that said, it's not like you can't enjoy this, because I thought within the first couple of episodes, the thing that caught me by surprise is how they took a decent amount of the original trailers, which before RWBY started up, what they did was they had 4 character trailers, each for the central girls, and it told a bit of a story to get you connected, to get a bit more understanding of what they'd have to offer. They incorporated that mixed in with the first couple of episodes to tell something that felt a lot more coherent, and it felt like a lot more organized than I would argue even the original did. And that's kind of part of the fun, is there's going to be moments that feel like they flow better, and then there's going to be other moments that feel maybe that they are a little too fast-paced. But given that it feels like episode 4 is when we're going to really get into the more new content territory, it makes sense to cover what they need to start out, and then just kind of probably do their own thing, while still staying true to a lot of the major plot points that people have come to know and love about the original. From what I understand, I don't think this is going to be a multi-season project. It does seem like this will probably be a 1 season and done, but then again, if it's popular enough and does well enough, the sky's the limit. Hell, look at all the anime sequels being announced a decade later. But it's something that I'm very excited to see more of. I think the production is fantastic. The animation is drop-dead gorgeous in those high-octane moments. Monty, if he was still alive today, bless his soul, he would be so happy to see what they were able to deliver, and I'm sure he would then even try to top what they're doing within his own work, because that's just the type of work drive he had. But ultimately, it's something that I think both new and old fans alike will get something similar but different out of. If you've seen the original, of course, we're waiting to see some of our favorite moments reanimated with that gorgeous 2D aesthetic and how they transition it into with the 3D camera works with a 2D presentation style. But of course, the new fans as well are going to experience basically the best that RWBY has to offer without really any of the negative baggage, both on production and sometimes sloppy writing. Because overall, I still think RWBY is one of the more fun shows that you can watch, and even if it does have dips, I've never hated watching a single season, and based on what I'm seeing here, it feels like fans making it, and based on the fact that the creators of the original project also had some influence on how this was working on, seemingly based on them knowing about it for quite a while and maybe giving ideas. It just feels like everything's going to work out for this one. And honestly, I think this will be a fun watch no matter if you're new or old to the fandom. I mean, there's a lot you can talk about with this. You could break apart scene by scene and, compare the old, compare the new. But really, I'm excited to see the new stuff. And I think as long as people don't expect a completely 100% accurate retelling, but more so things that will seem similar but also vastly different with the new story, I think everyone's going to have a great time if they have the right mindset and not just expect, oh, they cut out this fight, well, therefore, we're not going to see every fight because we're telling 13 and 12 episodes of both new and old content, and more often than not, I think it flows well, even if there was a bit of fast pacing towards the end of episode 3, and I guess at the beginning of episode 3 as well. But thoughts if you have any on RWBY, and how excited are you to check out episode 4? Let me know down below, leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you're new around here. Till next time, everyone, please take care and have a good one.